Hi, everybody. This is Marlene with Miami Ghost Chronicles, Stories of the Supernatural, and how you all doing tonight? Well, tonight I have a very special lady with me. She is, we were talking a little bit earlier. She calls herself a tombstone tourist, and I said, "Hey, that's what I am too." But I never heard it put that way. But that's exactly what she is. Her name is Kathleen Shanahan Maca, and she's a freelance writer and she's a photographer. And she has a love for old cemeteries, architecture, genealogy, and history. She left the advertising industry over 20 years ago to focus on her family and writing, and she considers it one of her best moves ever. I commiserate. And she is the author of Ghost of Galveston and Galveston's Broadway Cemetery. How are you doing today,
I'm
Kathleen?
great, Marlene. How are you doing?
Good, good, good. Um, yeah, like we were saying earlier, that thing about when the that we were talking about that some people, if they don't really understand or know about the origins, especially the older cemeteries, to go into a cemetery, it wasn't a morbid thing. You were not out there, well, first of all, not to destroy property, but it was like you could even have a picnic out there with your family, and nobody thought it was anything weird. So, but times have changed, I guess.
I know. You don't have to be goth to love a cemetery, but they tend to think you do.
You
So
do, and right now you tell everybody hang out at a second cemetery, and they look at you like, "Yeah, really?"
they take a step back.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. So let me ask you something, Kathleen. How did you? I mean, was it something that you got interested in as an adult, or did it start as a child? How did you get interested in that?
In cemeteries in
Yes.
particular.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, as a child, when I used to spend summers at my grandparents' farm in Oklahoma, of course, we would do the old tradition of going around and at least once a year decorating all of the family graves. It was
Okay.
something families used to do. So we would drive around the countryside to cemetery after cemetery. And once we got the individual graves cleaned up and decorated, my grandmother would want her alone time with whoever it was.
Okay.
And my grandfather, who wasn't related by blood, would walk me up and down the rows and tell me stories about all the people. Well, this is so and so, and he owned the livery stable. And if I, cleaned out
He
the
knew the
stall,
skinny on everybody. Right?
yeah. So I learned really fast that they weren't just, dates and names, that they were real people with stories. So it was like a storybook. You just had to be
Right.
interested enough to, if you'll pardon the pun, dig up the story.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure he'd do all the dirt too. Like maybe he didn't tell you, but he was like, "Yeah, and yeah." So and so, yeah. But that's great. You know what? Because unfortunately, nowadays, people don't do that anymore. As far as maybe on an anniversary, possibly on certain holidays, but um, more and more people. I don't know if it's because people are busier, but they don't do that anymore. As far as
Yeah,
going to the cemetery and of course now, especially if you live in a bigger area, knowing like what you said, your grandfather knew everybody when they were alive.
yes. And now we're such a mobile society now that a lot
Yes.
of people move away from where their family homes were and the family
Yes.
graves are. So it's not as much a tradition as it was.
No, it's not. It's not. And also cremation and even what we said earlier, nowadays even tombstones are very practical. They're very, you know, like minimum information,
Yeah, that
flat, depending where you're at. But
something perpetual care that they can mow over.
yeah, I hate to say it, but yeah, it's because I don't know if it's because the cost for some families, it's just easier to, you know, overall, whatever the situation, but it's not like it was. And we were also something that we were talking about before. We're talking here like many, many years ago. Um, People really got into uh, the appearance of their either their mausoleum or their graves or their family plots because some people, like everybody, got interred from a certain family.
Yes.
So they put a lot of, like, you see those big huge, some of them, uh, statues that they're like, wow, they really put a lot of thought into it.
Yeah, they're beautiful. There's an entire historic cemetery district in Galveston right on the main street, and that's what the first book, The Galveston's Broadway Cemeteries, is about. but there were actually so many wealthy families back in Galveston back in that time period
Mm-hmm.
that they would hire the best sculptors from France and Italy to come over,
Wow.
stay, and carve all of the angels and the ornate work for their mausoleums and their graves, and then they would go home because they had that expendable income, and that's just not
Right.
something you see nowadays.
Oh, no, no. And, like what you said, first of all, they had the deeper pockets, number one. Number two, it's almost like a family's reputation, even in death. You had a reputation to uphold. So,
Absolutely.
yeah, I know that people really cared because, I've even said it, even after death back then, if you were disreputable or had some type of wayward life, they wouldn't even sometimes allow you to get buried in the regular cemetery, or they'd make you in that corner way back there behind the weeds.
True. It's
Because
true.
even back then, there was like, like, no, 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 this is the good, decent people. And, in other words, you had a reputation even after death, where people cared about that.
It's true.
And if you think about it, it's like, who cares? You're dead. But back then, the family was. And I mean, I did some research, and even members, if you had like one member of the family that went off and did something improper, be it a man
Mhm.
or a woman, the family, if they were lucky, would bring them back and bury them. But like on the sly, like, yeah, put them back there, and okay, we'll put this little tiny headstone.
Or
It was like, we're
sometimes,
going to show our disapproval even after
yeah,
you're
sometimes
dead.
they buried them with the family, but they wouldn't mark their grave.
Right.
So
Yeah.
the family would know they were there, but there wouldn't be any shame in having their name associated with them.
Yeah. Yes. As a matter of fact, the other day I was doing research on something, and this happened, I want to say, what was it, 1913, 1912. It was a little bit right after the turn of the century. Well-to-do family out of New York. Okay. Back then people didn't divorce, but I guess the parents separated, and the dad goes off and he's living in Lexington. And one of his daughters, she's 26 years old. She's already gone off and married, and she lives in Chicago. The story
Mhm.
is that for some reason she comes to visit her father in Lexington. Apparently, back then ladies took that laudanum thing. Well,
Yes.
she had become dependent on, well, they say, they didn't say laudanum, but they said something the equivalent that you understand, the equivalent of what we call opioid dependency. She had it for
Yes.
2 years, and I guess it was wrecking her life. And she had gone to see her dad, and basically she couldn't get a hold of any drugs, and she took carbolic acid and killed herself in her father's arms. Very dramatic.
Mm.
Well, guess what? They buried her by herself in Lexington. The rest of her family, her brothers and sisters, her parents, and everybody got buried in a very nice tomb in New York and Vermont, where the family's originally from. But she got left by her lonesome.
And that's so sad because it's kind of like insult to injury, right? You lead a
Yes.
sad life, and now we're going to put you over here.
Yes, no, as a matter of fact, I remember now, her father was a doctor. He was a doctor. The family was well-to-do and everything. And it was, I think it was not only the shame of that she killed herself because of, back then, of course, suicide, made the papers. They couldn't even hush it up because she took carbolic acid. And
Right.
because, I guess, maybe she had done things because of she was addicted. She was an addict. Like, it was
Hmm.
like, okay, well, we'll bury her, but okay, so that nobody will know that she's part of our family. And obviously her husband didn't want her either, and she had children, by the way.
That's so
So
sad.
everybody like cut ties, cut cords with her. So yeah, back
And see,
then,
if I were her, I would haunt people.
yeah, I know, isn't it? But yeah, and it's like I looked at that and it was like, God, who knows what was going on with her? I'm thinking maybe she already had troubles in her own marriage. That's why she went to see her father in Lexington.
Hmm.
And God knows what was going on with her. But yeah, and I'm sure a lot of things like that happened where somebody, you wonder sometimes you come over, especially if you find these little snippets in the newspapers where, yeah, the family's from one part of the country, but this one solitary person's buried. And it's usually something along those lines that they did something, and I hate to say it, there was a lot less tolerance for women of what they could get away with before the family was outraged and wanted to disown them.
Yes, exactly.
So let me ask you. I know you wrote the Broadway Cemetery, which has to do with all the graves, like you said, of which must be beautiful. That a
It
lot of
is.
these families, but you also wrote the Ghost of Galveston. Have you
Yes.
had any encounters with the paranormal?
Well, Galveston's a very haunted island,
Yes, I believe.
so it's funny that it's different in that you can go down the main the the shop district and go from store to store. And I challenge people when I go on speaking engagements that the next time they go visit Galveston Island to go in several shops and just ask the first person they see behind each counter, so tell me about your ghost. And they will stop what they're doing and tell you their ghost story
Oh my.
because
So everybody's
every
got one.
every building has one, everybody's home seems to have one. So there's no shortage of ghost stories, and they're actually very proud of them on the island. It's
Oh,
part of
I'm
the
glad
island
to hear
culture.
that. It's not none of that. Oh no, we can't talk about that kind of thing, right?
No.
That's great. That's great. Because you go to some place and you think you guys gotta have ghost stories, and you're like, I'll meet you out in the alley. We'll talk about it. It's like really, because. But no, I can imagine because I know that a lot of people think of Galveston because of that huge hurricane that came through and like
Yes.
basically flattened it. But there was quite a history prior to that hurricane for Galveston, right?
There was, before the hurricane hit, of course, there were several governments that came through and settled because Texas changed hands between countries several
Mm-hmm.
times. And there were Indians that lived on the island.
Wow.
And the settling period was very, shall we say, contentious. There were a
Yeah,
lot of
yeah.
shotguns involved. And there were several hurricanes before we called them hurricanes. Before the
Yes.
big 1900 storm, there were yellow fever epidemics. I think
Yes.
there were five major ones. And in
Wow.
fact, one of them was the impetus to actually we have to establish a cemetery because we've lost 250 people in this one year
All at
alone.
once. Yeah, I can
And
imagine.
back then that was a big chunk of the population.
Yes.
And there was also a Civil War battle fought on the island.
Really?
So, before the 1900 storm even hit, there were ghosts reported, and they were even reported in the newspapers.
So yeah, that's what I'm saying. That land has the history and things happening on it. Because a lot of people think, well, yeah, I'm sure that there are ghosts or ghost stories tied into what happened with a hurricane, but even prior to that, there was history there.
Yes. Jean Lafitte, the pirate, had a house there.
Really?
Yes.
Oh,
So there was a lot going on that island before the storm hit, which
right.
makes the history really colorful.
I think that is. And so what happened? And the reason why I ask is I know sometimes people have their own personal experiences with the paranormal, or in your case where you spend a lot of time in the cemetery, not necessarily looking to have an encounter, but one of those things where either you realize it or after the fact you go, wait a minute, that was that a real person, or did you ever have that type of encounter?
I never have in a cemetery, and I find on the whole, although that's kind of the Hollywood thing is ooh,
Yes.
haunted cemeteries. I find on the whole that would be a silly place to haunt unless there
Yes.
were some people that were executed in the cemetery in Galveston
Mm-hmm.
during the Civil War because it was part of the Potter's Field and they just shot them and buried them where they fell.
Wow.
But usually that's not where they died or where they lived or where the people had any kind of big experience. So there would be no reason for them to haunt just where their body was buried. It makes a good ghost
Yeah, I
story, but
know
it doesn't
that, and
really go.
everybody, people, it's not the first cemetery though that I've heard. There was another one. I think it's in New Zealand, and I'm sure there's other places that they did the exact same thing. The people, the convicts that were slated to be killed, like executed for their crimes,
Yes.
they would put them on a train, take them into the cemetery proper. And as a matter of fact, they had an area called Murderer's Lane where they would hang you, like exactly like what you said, execute you, which at that time was hanging. And they'd already have you know, your plot, like your hole dug. Of course, they wouldn't put a mark. I think it was just a number or something. It was very efficient.
Yeah, it was very economical with their time. You do it
Yeah,
all at once.
yeah, exactly. It's like, matter back then, people, when it came to stuff like that, where they were less sentimental about, yeah, hey, you're either a prisoner or you're a criminal. Forget it.
Right.
So you said not at a cemetery. Does that mean you've had something happen to you somewhere else?
I have almost everybody I know that lives or works in Galveston has had some sort of experience, or for sure they know somebody who's had some experience. Um, we actually had hosted the ghost hunters when they probably like their third
Mm-hmm.
season when they were on TV. Part of
Right.
their crew came down and did a overnight ghost hunt at a home that I used to docent
Okay.
in. And it was kind of amusing because they were looking for, full body apparitions and things
Yes.
that, would go on TV. But what was being missed were those of us who were in other rooms actually having things happen to them.
Yes.
So it was kind of comical. But yeah, it's just not unusual to see kind of visions or a face or feel somebody there or
Mm-hmm.
feel chill. You can, if you're looking for to have an experience, Galveston's probably a really good place to go to try it out.
Oh, I bet. I bet. And you know what? I find in my experience, it's people like what you're describing, the docents, the people that are, or give the tours, that they're day in and day out, and the majority of the time, nothing really significant happens. But they're there
Hmm.
enough of the times, especially, before or after somebody's there, either opening the place up or closing it down,
Yes.
that they have those experiences, even if it's auditory, if it's something like that, they hear like, okay, I'm the only one in this place. So I know, and I'm not the one making the noise. So
Right.
yeah,
And they know they're more familiar with what's a normal
yes,
house noise or a normal
hmm
building noise for that particular
or
location.
smells or anything like that, of course.
And honestly, the docents are usually the ones most reticent to talk about it. They're not the ones sharing it because that's not, they're more interested in sharing the history. They're not going to tell you
Yes,
the ghost stories. So it's kind of a
right.
catch-22 there.
Well, you know what, and I guess also depends on who's, who the, what the rules are. I imagine sometimes, or like you said,
Absolutely.
before I know it, I'll be giving a ghost tour instead of a tour of the property. So
Yes, yes.
they don't want to take away from that.
And I understand that too.
Sure, sure.
Like you can take a historical tour or you can take a ghost tour with somebody else.
Exactly. Especially if you're there, if they, especially if they know a lot, their knowledge is, like in other words, because I think that happens that if once you get to know the actual history of that family or who families that live there, they almost become three dimensional for you. They're not just somebody you read about. You know so much about them or about what
Yeah,
happened to them that you want to talk about it because you say this. If it wasn't for these people or what happened here, there would just be a structure. That's it. So,
absolutely.
so yeah, I totally understand. Is there because I've seen when you look at those pictures of Galveston, like when the hurricane came through,
Yes.
how many lives were lost after all was said and done? Because
Well,
I know they were basically caught, not unawares, but there was just no place to go because of the tide, I imagine, right?
they were actually pretty caught unaware. I mean, there was no radar at the time.
Right.
And the gentleman who was the head of the weather office there knew something was happening and knew that the readings were different. And there's a book about him called Isaac's Storm. And if you're interested in that sort of thing,
Mm-hmm.
it's probably the
Yes.
best book about hurricane to read. It's really fascinating. But there was no great warning system or anything. So by the time the tides had gone out and come back in and they knew that they were really in trouble, they were already cut off from the mainland. There was
Yeah.
just, little bridge and the little railroad bridge, and those were gone underwater already.
Yeah.
So there was nowhere to go because the water went across the island.
Right. Yeah.
And
There was no. Was there? I want to say there wasn't any high ground. There wasn't any place.
no, it's an island. It was flat.
Yeah.
So, even some of the tallest buildings collapsed in the
Mm-hmm.
winds and waters. Some of them didn't. Some of the two-story homes survived. It was kind of a hit and miss.
Yes.
But about 6,000 people, which was a huge percentage of
Yes.
the population, perished within a 24-hour period.
Oh.
So imagine what that would cause if you believe that, there's residual energy from
Oh,
a traumatic event,
absolutely. I
and
mean,
it's across the island. So,
and this is the thing. It's like, it's not for lack of trying, but when that realization, exactly what you described, there's no place to go.
no.
There's no mountain to climb. There's no tree. There's. I mean, maybe if you were lucky, I guess in some cases to get to a certain building that didn't go down.
Yes. And there were a handful of the extremely wealthy families in Galveston that had the beautiful homes that, a handful of them still exist on Broadway. But they were welcoming people in. They were encouraging people to come to their homes because they were sturdy homes.
Right.
And, they might have 200 people under their roof. And, when the water started coming in, they would herd everybody upstairs. But it was a very protective community. It's not that they kind of locked their doors and said, "Oh, you live in a wood shack, bye."
Yeah, it's so too
They
bad.
really tried. It was just, there was not much they could do at that point. There's a famous story about the orphanage that was right on the beach, St. Mary's, and there were 90-something children and 10 nuns. And as the waters rose, the nuns each tied about 10 children to them so that they wouldn't get separated in the water.
Wow.
And there were 2 little boys who were not tied to nuns, and they actually were swept away but got caught in the top of a tree and held on through the night. I can't even imagine.
Wow.
And they were the only survivors. All of the other children and the nuns perished.
Can you imagine?
It's just shocking. And I think that's the one that people tell the most often because it's
Yes.
so heartbreaking that so many children died in one place.
You would have
But there
thought those were the 2 that were definitely. That's
Right.
also your destiny, I
Right.
guess, up to a certain point. But that is incredible. And you know
Right.
what? I've lived in South Florida all my life, so I know about hurricanes, and I did Andrew and everything. So, and so I can. That's why I'm saying I understand very, very well
Yes.
what you feel but I'm thinking, can you imagine not knowing? First of all, being caught unaware, or by the
Right.
time you're actually aware, knowing there's no place to go, and just hoping that, like you said, the second story of a home or a building, and God,
Yeah,
I'm
because
telling
I
you.
mean, you're aware because you live in a hurricane-prone area as well that
Yes,
the
yes,
days always seem to start out beautiful blue sky,
yes,
and it was a lovely day, so let's all go to the seashore, and
yes,
then all of a
yes.
sudden it changes on you.
People
It's
don't
not like
realize how fast. When I say fast, I'm saying within a few hours,
yes,
the weather switches out, even when you've got a major hurricane coming in.
exactly,
I,
exactly.
yeah.
There were some gentlemen in a cafe downtown, and they were told at one point in the afternoon that there was a bad storm coming, and they left. There were 13 people in the building, 13 gentlemen, and they refused to leave because they said, we're in a brick building, it would take something big to kill me. And they were actually the first ones to die because the building collapsed. And it was the very first building on the island to collapse. So, it's like, don't shake your finger at, at the
Well,
weather.
no, you know what? And besides the forecasting problems, it's well, especially here, like where I lived, after especially, even though I mean, I grew up with hurricanes, but nothing quite as, which and that it made them switch the building code, to
Yes.
certain specifications.
Hmm.
But even then, you know, people have this problem, this realizing that, yeah, you know what, even a brick building, it's going to go flat. And well, in that case over there, I imagine it wasn't only the winds, it was the surge, from the ocean, right? That just,
That's exactly what it was. It just would knock buildings off their
yeah,
foundation or just knock them over immediately. I mean, people still have the problem today. I mean, I live in Houston and we just had Harvey, and
yes.
there were a lot of people that have lived here all their life, and oh, we've been through this one and we've been through that
Hmm.
one, and they were just kind of tempting fate, saying, "Well, my house is never flooded." Well,
There you go.
if it was underwater, and the majority of Houston's never been underwater, but it can happen. So
Yes.
I can't even imagine not knowing the storm was coming. How horrid that would be.
Yes. And especially if there was a time period, if you have a few years go by where there's no really bad weather, and new people come into the area, or
Yes,
and let's face it, we're
always happens.
and then the next thing you know is like exactly like what you described with those guys. It's like, this is the brick structure. Forget it. We'll just have a hurricane party. We hear that all the time over here in South Florida and the Keys, where people say
Exactly.
they're going to have a hurricane party. It's like, all right, okay, all right. Sometimes it is, but I wouldn't take a chance on that. But
No, no.
and I imagine that because and one of the things that I tell everybody, because down here back in 1928, we had a really bad hurricane around Lake Okeechobee, and I'm thinking that the worst has got to be the people that have to go over there to basically locate and find or help any survivors that they're hoping for.
Yes, because imagine 6,000 bodies at once.
Yes, my
I
God,
mean,
that must.
it was pretty incredible, and obviously hard on the survivors as
Yes.
well. And they figured out pretty fast that they would have to get rid of the bodies. They weren't going to be able to give everybody a nice funeral
Right, that's
because
why I was going with that. That I imagine they must have had a lot of mass burials, right?
so, well, the first thing they decided to do was they gathered the bodies on carts and took them over to the Strand, which is right on the harbor. And
Oh, did I lose her? Kathleen, can you hear me? Because I think I lost you. Oh, I think I lost her. Hello, Kathleen. Let me see if I can get her back on. Kathleen, if you can hear me, I'm going to try to reach you right back. Okay, stay put. Let me call you right back. Cross your fingers, guys.
should we try that again?
Yes, here we go. I got you back. You know what?
Okay,
Um, it's just like when all else fails, turn it off and turn it back on.
exactly. Technology,
So,
I love it.
it's like, forget it. I'm not going to waste any more time on this. But anyway, you were saying
So
that
get
you
the
were saying
bodies
about the
up on
mass
the back end.
burials that they
Yes,
decided right away that
they took all of the bodies over to the Strand and made temporary morgues out of
okay.
the business buildings that are now tourist shops. So there were bodies stacked in all of those buildings along the street, and they loaded them on barges and took them out in the bay to get rid of them there because there were too many to bury. Well, 3 days later, everybody washed back.
I was about to say, because
Yeah.
I was thinking, okay, there's a bunch of people that were probably caught on land, but I'm thinking there was probably a bunch that got washed out.
Yeah,
But
it wasn't good. Everybody that they took out on barges came back. So at that point, they had to kind of distribute the bodies throughout the island and have funeral pyres. But there were a lot of people as well that, as they were found, they were just buried where they were found.
yes,
And in many cases, if there was something identifying on the person, like
hmm
a ring or a necklace, they would take that, put a little paper tag on it, and mark where they buried the body and take it to City Hall. So there were boxes of jewelry and personal items that later, in months later, people could go through to try to figure out where their person was. I mean, there were people buried
right.
in yards and on the street and everything. So it was pretty horrific to go through.
And the
But
smell must have been God.
I can't even imagine.
They must have had to. I hope they paid those. And I say it. Besides being gruesome, I hope they paid them well, because you must have needed nerves of steel and I don't know what inner
they
fortitude
were
to do that work.
they were actually each issued a bottle of whiskey. I mean, there was no funds to do this. They just had to band together to do it. And there were
Wow.
some that were pressed into service, and there were some that just knew they had to volunteer to do it. But that's one of the reasons why the Strand is so haunted, is because it was used as a morgue, and there was so much sadness there. And
Yes.
in fact, one restaurant that's on the ground floor of one of the buildings, on certain nights, when people look up at the ceiling, they can see bodies floating because
Really?
those are the bodies that were pinned by the floodwaters and drowned against the ceiling. But
Oh,
they've actually seen them floating against the ceiling,
wow.
which I think would just be a little bit unnerving and make me put my
I
hand over their mouth.
bet. It's like, yeah, what is that? Oh, but you
Hi.
know what? But it makes it, and people don't realize even I say because sometimes there's two types of hauntings. There's something that imprints on the fabric of either a building or a location when something like that happens, that traumatic. Okay, because it's just not one person. These are
Yes,
scores of people running for their lives and then not finding a way to live or getting drowned or and then
exactly.
you get your active hauntings where you get which is something totally different. But yeah, there's a lot of times where and let me ask you, is there any type of phenomena that's associated sometimes with the weather gets bad or similar to a hurricane where all of a sudden certain things are seen?
There are the first two things that come to mind immediately are when it's stormy weather or bad weather is coming in.
Mm-hmm.
There are two hauntings in particular that seem to occur, and one is Mr. Gresham outside of his home, which is now called the Bishop's Palace. You can look it up online. It's an exquisite residence.
Okay.
But he's seen outside walking around the house to make sure everything is secure. And that's
Wow.
really the only time I've ever heard people say he's spotted is during stormy weather. And the
Okay.
other one is Sister Catherine, who was one of the nuns that was lost in the 1900 storm.
Mm-hmm.
She and some of her charges are tend to be spotted at a beautiful hotel called Hotel Galvez. And especially during stormy weather, she tends to pace outside and then inside the corridors, trying to kind of make sure everybody's safe.
Wow. And you kind of almost understand why that would be. If you think of her last hours or whatever of life, this is what she was trying so desperately to do.
Exactly, exactly. And Mr. Gresham had a house full of people because he was one of the gentlemen who was welcoming everybody into his home, trying to keep them safe. So, of course, he would be pacing outside, making sure the home itself is secure.
Yeah. And that makes almost like when they're that I imagine it's such an overwhelming urge uh because at that point you're thinking, okay, this is somebody that is thinking I got to do this. This could mean life or death for me. In other words,
Yes, and it obviously did.
yeah.
There was back on the Strand, there was a school teacher who was on the second floor of one of the buildings, and the water actually reached the second floor. So the people were on the second and third floor. And she was very brave, but she stepped out on the ledge of the building and was pulling people in from the floodwaters.
Okay.
And if they were already deceased, the gentleman in the building would stack the bodies toward one side of the room. And if they were still alive, they were placed on the other side of the room. And she remained in the building for 3 days trying to nurse the wounded, but eventually succumbed to disease herself.
Wow.
And she and a little boy are very, very busy in that building on a regular basis.
I
The
bet.
shopkeepers know them well. The little boy is kind of a prankster. He's always pulling stunts.
Hmm.
So they're very beloved, and people are very protective of them because they were lost in such a horrible way, but they're really sweet spirits.
Well, and that's what I was going to ask you. Usually, especially you have so many deaths in the bodies and the heat and everything that if they had any outbreaks of disease, because that's such unsanitary conditions for the people that are left behind.
Absolutely. I mean, it's understandable.
So it was like let's add insult to injury.
Exactly. Exactly. Hurricanes are not fun business.
No, I imagine what was it. The population must have been like what scattered. I imagine whole families had to have been lost. Uh,
Yes, absolutely. There were entire families that were lost. There were almost every family on the island at least lost part of their family. And at that point, many people moved away and never moved back because they just couldn't stomach going through it again. But
yes.
it's impressive that so many people stayed and were determined to rebuild
Let me tell you something. That's a special
and
person
did.
right there. That is a special person right there
Absolutely.
because especially if you had any heartbreak for yourself personally, if you lost some type of family member,
Hmm.
uh, It takes a special person to decide I'm going to stay here and I'm gonna make it work somehow. Yes. And as far as well, we're talking about ghosts that are associated with a hurricane. Are there any other ghosts that are known throughout there for whatever reason that are well known in that area that are not that didn't come about because of the hurricane?
Actually, there are quite a few. There's a gentleman that haunts the Railroad Museum, which is in the old railroad station.
Okay.
And he wasn't originally from Galveston, but he came in on a ship and got his best clothes on and went into town into the little having fun for sailors district, shall we say?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
And
Yeah.
the last time he was seen, he was walking with a staggering step, quote unquote,
Hmm.
and then nobody saw him again. And as the train was coming down the middle of the city, the Strand District later that night, the engineer thought he saw something by the track. So they
Oh
stopped the train and he and his watchman walked backward and they found a body but no head.
God.
So they took the body to the train station and called the police. The police came out. They were tracking up and down trying to find the head, and they couldn't find the head. Well, they actually found it 3 hours later. And what had happened is the train that ran over him
Oh.
knocked his head up in under the train, carried it all the way to the train station,
Oh my
where
God.
when they stopped, it rolled out. And when it rolled out, he still had his derby hat on.
Are you?
So
What are the odds on that? That's
it's pretty
incredible.
amazing. It's pretty, and these were Victorian times too, so the newspapers were just gruesome. And I know what color underwear the man was wearing.
Yeah,
They
I know. I've heard
went
that
that
they
detail of everything. It was amazing. But he had a wife and daughter in New York, and I often wonder, do they even know what happened to him? Because he was buried on the island by his shipmates, and I'm sure they went back and said he was killed in a terrible accident. But did they tell his wife what happened, or
I mean,
he
was
just?
it suicide? I mean, because
Oh, no, no, no. He was just drunk and wandered on into the train track.
oh, okay, because sometimes you know, it was like talk. Let me tell you, see, it is. See, he's a good candidate for a haunting because God, you know, you go out for a drink and the next thing you know, your head's been chopped off. God, that's
Yeah.
horrible. And then it
And
rolls out from under the train.
I know. Can you imagine? But I kind of love deep down that they were so insistent on making sure everybody knew that his hat was still on.
Well, it's like okay, well, I know. I sometimes I've read some of these articles. Sometimes the older ones, like what they make up for not having photography back then, so they kind of
Yes,
painting word picture kind of things. Like you said, they were pretty detailed. It's like okay, I'm glad you're like also uh, your descriptive, your adjectives is like yeah, I've seen that. That sometimes it's depending on what they were describing. Sometimes they use a lot of euphemism, but other times they just gave it to you straight, like, and you're like,
did.
thanks.
They did.
But
Well, there was another gentleman that was a regular in one of the houses of ill repute, and he happened to pass away while he was there one afternoon on his lunch hour. And because he was a respected member of the community, of course, they didn't want to damage his reputation. So the
yes.
madam called the sheriff, and the sheriff came, and the madam and the sheriff loaded him into a car, took him to the city park, and propped him up on a bench so it would look like he fell asleep and passed away on the bench.
That is, oh, I'm telling you, reputation was everything back then.
Yes. And he's said to haunt the house that was the bordello because they forgot his keys and he's looking for his keys.
You know what? I can, and this is because I've been doing this for a lot of years, and I say, you know what? People sometimes, when they hear about, supposed hauntings, like you said, the keys, you go, he's haunting because of keys. But you know what? When we're caught up in our thing as individuals, as people, it's the big
Yeah,
deal.
it is.
It is
It
for
is.
him. It's a big deal. Keys? Are you kidding me? You're gonna stay behind because of keys? But maybe back then, keys was usually, especially I don't know what year we were talking about, but usually the person that had the keys was the person. This was like a sign of authority, you know.
Yes. Yes.
So
But there are lots of just kind of scattered hauntings that don't really have to do with the 1900 storm. The beautiful library, the original library, is still active on the island. And the original librarian, the gentleman who they first hired, was very dedicated. He never married. He even left all of his money in his will to the library.
Wow.
And he is said to hang around in the children's section. And if children misbehave or are abusive toward the books, he thumps them on the head.
Oh, I love it. It's like,
So you kind of have to love that.
but you know what? See, and that's another thing. People don't realize that, because everybody thinks of workaholics as like a modern thing, where people like work, work. I go, back then, people would have these jobs that they would keep almost their entire adult lives. They would work 30,
Exactly.
40, 50 years. I mean, he sounded extra dedicated, but this was normal when you had these positions where you would be there your entire life. So I could see where, especially if you didn't have a family, no wife, no children. So his family with the books. So
Yeah, you were very protective of your domain, and that was his domain.
yeah, talk about the opening scene from Ghostbusters. See, this is the male version of that.
That's what that scene always reminds me of, is
Yeah.
Mr. Patton.
Yes, yes, and also, and I'm glad you brought that up because a lot of people think always that hauntings have to be like this tragic, violent end, like this guy that got his head chopped off by the train, whatever. But not necessarily. You do get sometimes hauntings for people that it's just that they were there so long that they don't want to leave.
Exactly. There's one in the downtown Houston library is haunted as well by the caretaker. The janitor used to
Oh,
live in an apartment in the basement with his
okay.
dog, and he would wander the hallways at night and play his violin.
Oh my God.
And again, never married, older man. He eventually passed away, but supposedly people still hear his violin. If you're in the library at night, you can
Really?
hear strains of a violin. So that was just
Right,
where
that's a
his
dead,
space
no
was.
pun intended, giveaway as to who it was because violin playing, it's,
Right.
who else is it going to be?
Exactly.
Wow. Yeah, yeah. And another thing is, back then, people really took their jobs seriously. Like, if you were given that responsibility, you really owned it. So it's no wonder that some of them, even after they've passed on, they like, I got to still keep doing this because nobody's going to do it like I do it. So
Exactly.
I've met some live people still that do that every once in a while. It's like take it easy. But yeah, that was a different time. Now I think sometimes
Some
nowadays
tragedy.
it's a
They
little bit
have some
less.
tragedy on
People don't own
all of
it.
it.
It's like forget it. It's in other words, it's 5. That's it. I'm out of here. Like my
Good
responsibility's
enough.
done. I don't care if this place burns to the ground. Bye. And back then it was a different type of mentality as far
Yeah.
as how much you integrated into it. And as far as modern, have you had? Are there any other sightings or things of that's happening in Galveston? Because I know, there, Galveston is beautiful. I'm sure eventually, of course, people moved back, but it's beautiful there.
It is. It's a beautiful town and very historic. They have one of the highest number of intact Victorian buildings.
Okay. And yeah, because a lot of them,
Obviously,
what
try
they've
to
been
rebuild
open as
most
bed
of
and
them right
breakfast and stuff
now.
like that.
There are a lot of bed and breakfasts. There are a couple of beautiful hotels. The entire shopping district, the Strand, is intact buildings. Most of them are pre-Civil War buildings that are intact that you can go
Really,
inside, which is pretty fascinating.
that's
Um, the Hotel Galvez, which is right on the waterfront, was actually built as one of the big signs that Galveston was returning. And it
okay.
was built in 1911. It was planned from
Oh, oh,
at
okay.
the time they cleaned up the hurricane, designed and built. It's a beautiful hotel. It's still a very nice place to stay. In fact, I'm writing a book just about the Galvez history right now. But
Okay. Yeah,
they
because
have quite a few ghosts there.
well, you know what? I've noticed that yeah, that communities or towns, whenever something happened, whether it was a hurricane or this was a sign that they were back in business. In other words, is that they would build these beautiful new buildings to get
To
people, whether it was tourists or
bring the
investors or
tourists.
just to come back because yeah. So let me ask, and
Yeah,
I'm
and there
wondering, were there any stories ever of people, there's always, after these big, especially the tragedies or events like this, there's stories of people that somehow or other knew that they needed to leave. Did, are there any stories of that, of people that left before the hurricane hit, like for unknown reasons, like, hey, I knew I had to leave because something was going to happen?
I have never heard of them.
Really?
No,
Okay.
I no, I've never heard any stories like that.
You know
Nobody
about
had foreboding. They just
Right, like
were.
I didn't get on the plane because, I something told me not to get on the plane, that kind of thing.
Yeah, no, unfortunately, they all stayed,
I was gonna say,
and some
okay,
of them are still there.
yeah, yeah,
When you go through the Hotel Galvez, the most famous ghost there is a ghost. They call her the Ghost Bride. Her name's Audra,
okay,
and she actually dates from the 1950s, which is pretty contemporary.
yes,
Um, when I was little, I used to hear about her, and they would say the 1920s, but when the research was done, it came out that she was actually there in the 1950s,
okay,
and she was engaged to a man who worked on a ship, and she was waiting at the Hotel Galvez, had checked in, he had gone out to sea, and when he came back, they were scheduled to be married.
mm-hmm,
So this was before the days of air conditioning in the 50s. So she would walk up to the turrets, which
okay,
were at the hotel, which were kept open for the breeze. And she would stay there and watch for his ship to come in day after day. And eventually she heard that his ship had been lost at sea.
oh,
She refused to believe it and kept up her routine for several days, but she eventually was so distraught that she hung herself in the turret.
oh my God,
Uh, what makes it even more tragic is her fiance showed up several days later because he had been rescued by a passing ship.
oh,
So Audra tends to cause a lot of electronic manifestations. There are times that the switch, in fact, there's one time in particular that the switchboard was getting rung from a particular room over and over and over at night. And somebody was obviously playing a prank. So the switchboard operator sent security up to check the room to see who was in there because nobody was checked into that room. And he came back down and said, not only isn't there anybody in that room, but that's one of the ones we're repainting. So there's no furniture or phone in the room.
oh, oh, oh,
So, yeah, there are a lot of little incidents that happen, and there are people that check out in the middle of the night if they're on the fifth floor because there's a little bit too much activity for their their
yeah,
liking.
yeah,
But there are a lot of people that reserve those rooms months ahead of time so that they can try to have an experience themselves.
yeah, and a lot of, back, that's terrible, Can you imagine if she just would have waited a few more days?
I know, if only.
If only, if only. And that's the thing. I mean, besides the fact that, obviously, your fiance you think has passed away. Uh, for for some people, or this was like in other words, their whole life was pinned on this one event. Especially if
Yeah,
you were a woman, back then, to getting married was the big thing. You were going to be Mrs. So and so. So it was like, and everything that came with it, which was children and, a home, the white picket fence, all that. So, yeah, it was
yeah, they
like,
just couldn't see beyond the tragedy.
yes,
There's a
yes.
little girl who haunts the hotel too that people always wish that they could see or hear. She's actually pretty cute. They can hear her bouncing her ball in the hallway. And there's one part of the hotel that when it was first built was an ice cream parlor and soda fountain. It was 1911. And it's now a spa, very beautiful spa.
Okay.
And when people are walking, I hear a little girl whisper, ice cream,
Oh,
because she still wants the ice cream.
yes. Have they ever been able to identify who she is?
No, they have no idea who she is. There's another little girl who's only spotted riding the elevator. She likes to ride the elevators, but they don't know who she is either.
Yeah. And you know what? And, I guess also modern times we're so used to everything being identified, but people don't realize back then, and let's say this is the Hotel Galvez, when you said it's built in 1911,
Hmm.
back then you could register and you could use any name you wanted.
Yes.
And nobody paid attention to who your kids were, what the name of your children were.
No.
So people came and went, especially children, and sometimes things made the paper and sometimes they didn't. It
Yeah.
depended. So who knows? Something could have happened, and
She could
uh,
have passed away there, or
yeah,
it could have been somewhere that she loved as a child. So after she passed away, she went back there.
yeah.
You just never know.
Let me ask you, did the hotel ever, because I know sometimes these, especially when you mentioned about the yellow fever, that sometimes they use the hotels like as either the basements as quarantine stations or things like that. Did they ever do that at that hotel?
That particular one was built after the yellow fever epidemics.
Okay.
It served as a barracks for uh, the Coast Guard during World War II. They took over the entire hotel and used it as a barracks. So there were
Okay.
some unusual incidents. But no, that particular hotel wasn't used as a hospital, but several of the large homes on the island were used as yellow fever hospitals
Yeah.
and tend to have hauntings because of it.
Right, right. Because at that time, a lot of, and even then, it was like sometimes they weren't sure how it was transmitted, so they would try to quarantine people, but unfortunately, it was like, uh, and also because I was thinking along the lines also of the Spanish influenza that occurred like what 1916 to 1918.
Yeah,
So I don't
yeah,
know if it hit Galveston that hard or not, but um, as a matter of fact, what they were saying is that uh, that the influenza mostly, usually like the yellow fever and all these different types of epidemics, that what they would normally take is the infirm or the old. And the Spanish
yes.
influenza seemed to pick on the younger people versus
Hmm.
the ones that typically went. So that's what I was thinking. But sometimes I'm always trying to think, okay, how does this child end up there? Which could have been a bunch of ways. I mean, for all you know, maybe her mom or her dad worked there and she often went
Exactly.
there.
Exactly.
You know, that happened a lot, especially sometimes in these hotels. The people that worked there like had a behind the scenes place where they worked from, like either the kitchens and things like that. So
Yes, the hotel doctor always brought his son to work. So his son, ran up and down the halls and knew everybody that worked there, and he kind of grew up there.
yes,
So it was just accepted.
yes, yes. And I love that story that you said about those two boys of all the ones that got swept away, the ones that they actually survived. Were there any other survival stories? Because I mean, sometimes it's almost like sheer luck. In other words, of people, the ones that get saved versus the ones that end up drowning.
Yes, yes. And there were actually entire books written about it. Um the when the bridge could be crossed to come back over to the island, Thomas Edison had just invented moving pictures, and he
Okay.
sent his motion picture crew over to film the devastation, which is pretty amazing. And if you go to National Archives and Google Galveston 1900 storm, you can
Mm-hmm.
actually watch Thomas Edison's film footage. So it
Wow.
it makes it real because they're not just still shots that are kind of fuzzy, they're motion pictures of it.
Okay.
But yeah, it seemed like all of the survivors, of course, not all of them were standing or staying in the bigger homes that were sturdy. Some of them rode house tops. I live about 40 miles north of Galveston, and there was a man and woman that rode the roof of their house all the way the bay up to near where I live, and actually slid off and drowned right as they reached the shore.
Wow.
It's just, they're story after story after story, and there's so many books, and some of them were written at the time, and I find those are the ones that are the most fascinating because they haven't kind of fictionalized them. They're People were just telling exactly what they remembered.
I can imagine that some of the and I understand exactly what you meant, that you could have one house that I don't want to say spared but didn't go down and people were actually maybe able to survive,
Exactly.
and
And
then
some of them,
others next to it were just totally demolished.
some of them were saved because there were so many that were built just of wood because the common building material. But when the waves would come through and knock down street after street after street of building, it would kind of wash them into a row. And some houses were spared because it almost made a dike around them,
Yeah.
the rubble. And then it would wash past those and knock down the ones on the street behind it. So it was very hit and miss, precarious. There was no predicting which ones would have survived.
Right. Right. It was like if you were lucky to have gone into the one that you should have gone into.
Yes.
That
And
is
there are so many homes on the island that did survive have plaques on the front doors, and you can spot them from the street as 1900 storm survivors. So you can go through and kind of tell, okay, this one survived, and those were the only ones for blocks. And then this one and this one survived. And it's really fascinating.
That is incredible. That is incredible. And, that's why, like I said, because of my own personal experience, I saw that firsthand where you would have a house that was still standing. I mean, damaged, but still there. Then right next to the one right next to it was totally flat. It was gone. All that was left was pieces of wood. Did you would think, how does that happen? And I've seen that. I've actually seen that firsthand. I mean,
some things never change.
No, they
we
don't.
can't control the weather.
They don't. And that's one of. I mean, I'm sad. It's sad for the people that died when you think about it, because there was such a huge loss of life. But then I think it makes such great stories for the human spirit as far as the people that survived and whatever
They
you said.
absolutely do. And, a lot of the ghost stories, there are people that come to Galveston just for the ghost culture. They want to talk to people that have ghost experience. They want to take the ghost tours. They want to go inside the building. I kind of set up my book so that you could read the history of the individual buildings, and I only included buildings that were still there, so you could go and see those buildings.
Perfect.
But there are people that go just for that reason. But my hope is that in addition to being interested in the ghost stories, because they're fascinating, they'll kind of get history coming in the back door. They'll learn about the other history of the island as well at the same time, because it's a beautiful place. It's not a scary place to go. The people that don't want to see ghosts just don't pay attention to that stuff, and that's okay.
I personally think that's the most interesting thing of the tours. That you get the ghost story, but then you get the history thrown in as to, the family or what the history of the house was, or before and after. I mean,
it kind of makes the stories make sense, puts them in context.
And that's another thing that, and you pointed that out earlier, Kathleen, where nowadays we're more transient, but back in those days, families would live for a really long time in these houses.
Yes, and honestly, Galveston is they call it BOI, and it stands for Born on Island. It's a dividing line. They will ask you when they meet you, are you BOI? And if you say no, but I've been here for 50 years, they kind of raise an eyebrow like, huh?
Yeah, quite, but not quite.
I'll give you partial credit. But, so many of the families have been there for 5 generations. The stone carving family that has carved some of the most beautiful monuments in the cemetery is now in their 5th generation of stone carving for the cemetery.
Wow.
They're generation after generation that live there, and there's a lot of pride having to do with it, because they are the ones that stuck it out and stayed for the rebuilding, and now they're here in this entirely different era of Galveston's history.
Yes. Let me ask, what can you tell me? Because I was looking that did they make it's a huge statue, like a monument. I think it's on the beach. I don't know. It looks like it's on the beach. What is it? A memorial for the storm. I think it's a man and a woman and a child or a baby.
Yes, that's actually fairly recent.
Okay.
I'm gonna get called on this, but I'm gonna say it's only about 15 years old. I'm
okay.
Grabbing that out of my head, and I'll get corrected as soon as I get off the air. I'll get a phone call about it. But yes, it's right on the seawall, and it's really a beautiful memorial. But it's a man holding a woman and child. It's just the top of their torso, and he's reaching up as if he's reaching out of the water.
Okay.
So that's for the 1900 storm victims.
Okay. Yeah, I was curious because I was thinking, I wonder when they put up this memorial because I think it's a beautiful memorial.
It is. It is. And, there are memorials and monuments all over the island. There to every war you can think of. In the cemetery, there are visible gravestones from the Spanish American War on every war. There are
Okay.
beautiful bronze monuments. In fact, one of the most beautiful and tallest monuments, the Monument to Victory, that's right in the middle of the island, went up just months before the 1900 storm, and it withstood it.
Wow.
Which is amazing.
Yeah. And let me ask you, because I know Galveston being an island, it has some type of fishing industry. Am I correct?
Oh, yes.
Do
Yes.
you have any ghost stories that are tied into the ships? Because ships are, sailors especially, are so superstitious, and they've always got somebody. They've got superstitions and ghost stories. Do you have any about any of the sailing ships?
A lot of the harbor ghost stories really tie back into the Civil War, because the battle was right on the waterfront.
Okay.
So a lot of the stories happen right there. But yes, if you talk to some of the local ship captains and the Mosquito Fleet, they always have really good stories. But I even found a story from I think it was the 1850s that was in the newspaper
Uh-huh.
about the woman who haunted one of the piers. She was the woman in white, and the people would leave their boats before she would come at night because she would go up and she was waiting for somebody. But
Really?
to have a haunting mentioned in the newspaper that long ago, and that was such a big part of the culture, it just tells you how long this culture has been going on the island. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I know, but and I imagine that's why I said that thing about around the time she was being sighted, those sailors, everybody must have cleared out of there like, oh, the sun's going down. Well, I'm going home. Bye. All right, I'm going to go
No,
drinking to the tavern. Bye.
it's true. It's true. They are a superstitious bunch, but they might have reason on this place in this particular place.
Oh, yeah, and that's the I hate to say it, but yeah, you always get a lot of these stories with either the bride or the wife or the widow, whatever, waiting. But people don't realize that back then that there was, whether it was a sailor there or anywhere, where sometimes they would be gone for more than a year on a sailing trip, or on a voyage, your husband. And if you're a woman, this meant a lot to you because basically, if you lost your husband, not only were you a widow, your everything, your whole world could go. I mean, besides, I'm taking the
It's
sentiment out of
exactly.
it, the love of, losing somebody you love, but also the how important it was to a family if you had children to lose your husband, you know.
Exactly. And of course, that's where the term widow's walk came, because they would have
Yes,
kind of a balconied area on top of the houses so the women could go up to the roof of the house safely and watch for their men to come back from sea. And some of them ended up waiting until they found out they were widows.
exactly, exactly. And like I said, we're so used to nowadays with instant information, the instant gratification, everything about everybody, even sometimes before they know it.
Exactly.
That yeah, sometimes you would get a letter that would be months, after it was written, and then yeah, that the best hope you had was that you would get an early, you would see that ship coming back in. So
Exactly. Exactly.
yeah, it I guess emotionally for a person, it develops like where this is your hope, this is your end all. This is not something that you're just hopeful about. This is the hope is that this person's going to come back.
Yes. Yes.
That
And it
is
didn't always happen that way.
Yeah, yeah, well, yeah, I know. I mean, there's a lot of stories around stuff like that as far as, or like you said, I've heard also of, especially with these sailors that would be gone for a while, they would have some accident and word would come back to the family saying that this person is dead. And sometimes it would show up a couple of years later that they had been picked up or rescued, but it would take them that long to get back to say, "Hey, I'm alive. I'm not dead." Yeah, I've heard of that. There's a few stories going.
Exactly. And heaven forbid that one of mine remarried. So
Oh yeah.
just out of self-preservation.
Well, it's again, it's a different time. People. Uh, I talked. Sometimes back then, there's people that would just like disappear, take up a new name, and move to another part of the country. You could do that. Things like that
Yeah.
did happen.
How are they
Yeah.
going to track you?
Or like what you said about that poor guy that that he got drunk and the train
Yes.
um took his head off, and he had family in another part of the country. And if you think about it, chances that his family found out would have been based on the kindness of strangers to contact whoever she was or whoever the family was. And like you said, and as much information as they wanted to give.
Exactly. And of course, there was a red light district on the island at several points in its history. And, these women came from all different directions and were using whatever
Oh
name
yeah.
they came up with. And when something happened to them, there was no way to locate. Their family never knew what happened to them, which is
No,
really sad.
no,
But there are all
because
sorts of stories with that. And they're also, during the 50s and 60s, the Rat Pack used to come to Galveston and
really,
perform
I
and
didn't know
stay at the
that.
Hotel Galvez. And oh, it was a big culture. There's some great pictures from that era, but it was a big resort town at the time. So they would come and perform in the nightclubs, and people would come stay
Wow.
at the Hotel Galvez and go eat at the Balinese that was over the water, and it was very glamorous.
I can
But
imagine. Yeah, when you're bringing in, yeah, it's the nightlife. When you see people like that, it's like, yeah. Let's face it. When the Rat Pack was there, they were like one of the best, well-known entertainers, and it's like if you see them there, I imagine that must have been fantastic for the businesses there because that's where people wanted to go, especially if they were performing there.
yes, yes.
Wow, that is. I haven't had the chance to go through most of my time that I've gone through Texas. I've done a few stops, but I really haven't had a chance to go exploring per se. But I've always
Mhm.
wanted to go to Galveston just because I know there's so much history there.
I hope you'll come. There's no end. I go there obviously all the time. I work there, and I write books about it. And there's no end to new things to discover, either about the history or the architecture, the people there. It's kind of a melting pot kind of society.
Hmm.
And it's just a really friendly community. So it's a great place to visit.
Oh, I absolutely sounds like it. Kathleen, what is your website in case anybody wants to get a hold of you or your books or that new one that you're coming out with, which
Oh,
is
great. It's just my first and last name.com. So it's Kathleen, KathleenMaca.com, KathleenMaca.com.
okay. Okay. And when are you planning to be? Do you have any idea when you're going to be releasing the book about the Hotel Galvez?
I am hoping it should be out by late summer.
Okay. Okay. You know, I hate to say it, but that'll be soon because nowadays it's like, oh, it's a new year. Oh, it's like a lot of people think. I think especially that happens when you're young, like a kid, like, oh, summer, that's really far off. But
I know.
when you become an adult, it's all of a sudden time compresses itself, and it's like
It does. It goes at the speed of light.
it does. It's like summer. Okay, that'll soon be here. Yeah, I know what that's like. Yeah, I know I imagine the research. That you're a researcher, so I know that sometimes that can be very time consuming, especially if you're trying to. Sometimes they write things, and sometimes they omit, or sometimes you got to dig, and I know sometimes the spelling on names can get kind of crazy. So yeah, I know that can be very time consuming. But I think it's
That's when the
fascinating personally.
genealogy.com comes in handy.
Oh yeah, I mean, are you? It's and especially the day. Well, I don't want you to give away your book, but in my experience, so many things happen in hotels. Besides the fact that it's been around over 100 years.
Well, absolutely. I mean, you can go era by era, and it's just fascinating, the stories that I'm hearing from locals and from the newspaper and from the official records. It's just amazing, the different people who've owned the hotel, the different people. Some people lived there for times, and it's a fascinating place. But it's really a beautiful hotel too.
Yeah, but it's, I mean, I know that hotels, especially if they're a little bit more upscale, they always want to keep their the prestige of their hotel, obviously. But there's so much that goes on in hotels behind the scenes, whether it's from the
It's
people
true.
staying there, from the people working there. It's like there's a lot. There's, especially in the longer, yes, hotels. Believe me, I'm sure you got your hands full. Have you been
As a
able to?
matter
Well,
of fact, if you look at the Ghost of Galveston cover of the
mm,
book, the
okay.
building cover is the Hotel Galvez.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yes, so
Okay. Yeah, because I've
they're
had
not
I've,
ashamed.
I've had the covers of your books on some of the slides, but I didn't realize that what was on the cover of that book was the Hotel Galvez. I didn't know
It
that.
is. It's a beautiful hotel.
Okay, so you're gonna okay, I'm looking forward to that book. So I'm gonna be recontact you and hoping that you'll come back on and we can discuss all the neat stuff you wrote about it. And I think also because of all the research, maybe there's stuff that if you don't have a chance to include it in the book because it doesn't tie in, that you still have that knowledge,
Right.
which are all those interesting stories
I
that you
know,
go,
I
really,
know.
that really happened there? Yeah, that happened.
We call them rabbit holes. It wasn't the direction I was going, but it was a rabbit hole I ducked into for a little while.
Yeah, and you can't help it because it's like, wow, uh, yeah, this really happened, and wow, okay. So much for, like I said, the it's back then reputation was everything, and if it was an upscale hotel, but and it was almost like what you said about that the guy that died in the brothel, how he was carted off.
It was very sweet of them.
I think it's very sweet, but it was like,
His wife never knew.
or even if she knew, she never let on. It was like, oh my God, he died.
Yeah, in the park, yes.
Kathleen, it has been wonderful to have you. I've enjoyed it so much, and thank you so very much for spending this time
Thank
on
you. It
here.
was
And like
great
I said, I'll be
talking to you.
recontacting you so we could discuss that book when it comes out for the hotel because it sounds truly fascinating.
Great. I'll look forward to it.
Take care.
You too.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Oh wow, guys. So what did you think? I don't know about you, but I loved talking to her about it, and I want to tell you why. I was born and raised in Miami, South Florida, so I've dealt with hurricanes and I've lived through some pretty horrific stuff. So, I mean, Galveston obviously is known for more than just a hurricane, but a lot of people, because of the huge loss of life back then, that was a lot of people. Um, that I wasn't kidding when I said I understand the mindset or the desperation that comes to people that were caught in those circumstances. Uh, and I wasn't even in a situation that was even close to that. But I totally get it, and I see it from the aspect of what causes hauntings, whether it's a residual or an imprint at a certain place because of the emotions that people went through. Because when they were dying, they realized, I'm going to die, or my family's going to die, or I can't protect my child. You get sometimes an imprint, doesn't have to be in the actual haunting of that person there. But then also, it is the prime um, catalyst for active hauntings. People that wake up one day and it's beautiful weather, and they or their families are dead, or they have no idea where they are in the middle of all of this. That's another thing, desperation. You're trying to keep together with your family or your children or whoever, and everybody gets swept away, and you don't know what's become of them, and you end up. I'm telling you, there's enough there, and I that back in 1992 when Andrew like whoosh, flattened here in South Florida, and I lived through it. My house was like, I was lucky. I'd stuck my kids under a sofa. I turned over my sofa and I stuck them under there. And that morning, the the weather was beautiful. I went supermarket shopping that morning, thinking, oh, let me get some extra supplies. I'll bring down the shutters on my house. But remember, I had grown up here, and I prepared like, oh yeah, maybe we'll have the lights out for a couple of days. And at that time, I had a gas stove, so I was like, oh, I'll be covered because I'll be able to cook, and I've got something for lighting, and it'll be inconvenient, but okay. Yeah. Let me tell you something. I had a huge tank of gas in the back of the house. That thing was gone. It was swept. I don't know where it went. I don't know where it ended up at. There was trees in that yard that were 20, 30 years old. They were gone. Psh, gone. Like, so I know firsthand that why there might be active hauntings associated in Galveston with that hurricane. And to me, my hope would be that at some point, some of these souls accept or understand what happened to them, or maybe their loved ones came for them. But at the same time, I can also see why there's a lot of them that those last moments of their lives or the last hours, whether they were trying to escape the surge or trying to find a place to go to, or why it would anchor them, because I think I don't think that there's any moment where a human being's emotions run so high as when you're trying to stay alive for hours. Because yeah, I'm sure maybe some people die quickly, but let's face it, not everybody. You tried to make it to a structure. Maybe you ran from there. Maybe you went to a house. Maybe then from the first floor you went up to the second floor, and at some point maybe you got on the roof, or you tried to get to a tree. And I mean, this sometimes happens. Takes a little while for you to finally, or that you're hanging on to dear life before you die, and all you're seeing around you is all these people being swept around you, dying, maybe calling out to you to help them, and you can't, because you can't let go of what you're hanging on to, because not you're going to die. And that's another thing, which I forgot to ask her about. And when you do research into any type of natural disaster, but let's go with hurricanes or storms, obviously there's people that die right away because they get drowned. They, like she said, they got caught in, maybe in a structure that they couldn't get out and they drowned, or they were swept out to sea, whatever the case might be, or something, debris hits them and they get killed. But guess what? Especially back in those times when the response time for help was not what it is now, there's people out there that were hurt that just died maybe a day later, or had debris on them and they died. They didn't die right away. It took them a while, either because nobody found them, okay, there was some place inaccessible, or maybe they had a broken leg or a broken arm, but they were still alive. But let's face it, here you've been like battered around, you've had salt water. I'm sure that not everybody died right that minute of drowning. I'm sure there was a lot of deaths, and I hate, for lack of a better word, that were probably slow and agonizing because there was just nobody there to rescue you. That's another thing. Remember, this is an island. Probably part of the ships that could have gone there maybe were destroyed. As far as, I guess, the cavalry, for lack of a better word, to come and go in there and help, it's not like today. So yeah, that they have a bunch of ghosts running around, absolutely. I haven't gone there and I want to go there, but I can tell you right now, yeah, I bet you they are. There's a lot of intelligent hauntings going on there. So anyway, guys, I hope you really like the show. Please subscribe to my channel, whether you're seeing the video on YouTube or you're catching the podcast version on any of the other platforms like iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, Podbean, you name it. Subscribe so that you can get notified of whenever I release new shows. Also, my true believers, don't forget about me. Send me your stories. You can go to miamighostchronicles.com, go to the Submit Your Story tab, and there it explains all the different ways that you can send me the story, or I'll find some way of contacting you so that we'll get it. Let me do the hard work. Just let me know that you've got the story. Like I said, it doesn't have to be about ghosts. It could be about cryptids, UFOs, unusual experiences. It could be family story that you guys have had for generations. It could be anything. Just get a hold of me and we'll take it from there. And I do want to thank you all for being part of my audience. Thank you so much because I know that that it's a choice, and I'm so very glad that you come and you spend some time with me hearing some of these interviews or listening to some of these stories. So thank you so very much, and take care, guys. You're all wonderful.